No one warned the healer that the wolf dying on her riverbank was an alpha king's son. Wren Ashdown didn't ask his name before she dragged him out of the flood, didn't ask before she spent the whole night pulling silver out of his ribs with her bare hands. She just knelt in the mud beside a dying stranger and did what she always did for anything broken enough to need her. She had no idea she'd just saved the last heir of the Duskryder line. No idea his wolf would open its eyes and call her mate before she'd even learned his name. And no idea that the scars she'd carried her whole life, the ones no healer could ever explain, were about to bring an entire army to her door. Asking for a girl who supposedly died 11 years ago. A girl whose name was written into her own skin. Chapter 1: The Wolf in the Rain. The scream tore through the storm like something with teeth. Wren Ashdown had lived on the border long enough to know that stretch of river was cursed. Everyone said so. Nothing that wandered too close after dark ever wandered back. She grabbed her satchel anyway. You are an idiot, she told herself, already running straight into the one place the whole valley agreed was death. A grown, functioning idiot. The rain had turned the riverbank into a wound, soft mud, black water. Lightning cracked overhead, and for half a second everything went white. That's when she saw him. Not a fence-line wolf, not the lean, scrawny kind that stole chickens in winter. This was the size of a warhorse, black as pitch, collapsed half in the water like something had simply thrown him there and left him to drown. Oh no, Wren said out loud to no one. No, absolutely not. I heal people. I have never once signed up to heal something that could eat me in 2 bites and still have room for dessert. He didn't care about her professional boundaries. Even through the rain she could see the wounds, long, cruel, edged with something silvery that hissed where the storm touched it. Silver. Her stomach dropped straight through the mud. Every healer on the border told the same story about silver-edged wounds, shadow wolf blades. Touch one without knowing the right rights, and you shared whatever fate had found the poor creature who'd taken the hit. She should have turned around. The wolf's eye opened, just one, gold, glazed with fever and something else, something that looked absurdly like recognition. Damn it, Wren muttered, already on her knees in the mud beside 800 pounds of dying predator. Damn it, damn it, damn it, fine, you win, but I want it noted for the record that I think this is a terrible decision, and I'm making it anyway. He didn't eat her. Getting him home nearly broke her back. There was no carrying something that size. She looped a rope beneath his forelegs instead and dragged and hauled and swore the entire way while thunder cracked the sky in half. You, she gasped, are going to owe me an obscene amount for this. I hope you're rich. I hope you're secretly a prince with a whole castle full of gold specifically for emergencies like nearly dying face down in a river. He made a sound, half growl, half groan. Yes, yes, undignified for both of us. Save your strength for not dying, please. By the time she got him through her door, her arms were shaking, her dress was ruined, she'd pulled something in her back she'd be paying for tomorrow. She lit every candle she owned and got to work. The silver had to come out first. She knew that with a certainty that didn't feel like her own, old instinct, buried deep, the kind you don't question, just fact, like knowing fire was hot. Tweezers, steady hands, a running stream of apologies every time he flinched hard enough to nearly take her head off. Sorry, I'm sorry, hold still, you enormous menace. Steam hissed from each wound as the metal came free. Slowly the smoke stopped rising. The bleeding didn't stop. Nothing short of a miracle could have stopped bleeding that bad, but it slowed. She packed the worst gashes with yarrow, pressed linen hard against his ribs, leaned her whole weight into it while his heart stuttered beneath her palms. Come on, she whispered, 3 hours in, hands numb, knees past aching. Come on. I did not drag 200 pounds of furious wolf across a flooding riverbank just to watch you quit on me now. His chest rose. Held. Fell again, slower, steadier. She let herself have one full breath of relief, and then exhaustion took her, dragging her sideways onto the floor beside him, one hand still resting on his ruined side, listening to a heartbeat that refused, against every reasonable expectation, to stop. She woke to wood smoke, rain-damp fur. And something else. Skin. Her eyes snapped open. The wolf was gone. In his place, sprawled the length of her hearthrug, dark hair, old scars, entirely too much bare chest, was a man. A big one, big enough to make her cottage look like a dollhouse with a mountain dropped in the middle of it. Okay, Wren said, okay, that's new. She should have been terrified. She was terrified, somewhere underneath the part of her currently cataloging, with far too much clinical interest, exactly how well built he happened to be. Fever climbing, not breaking. Hey, she said low, the voice she used on frightened animals. Hey, can you hear me? You're safe. You're on my floor, which isn't ideal for either of us, but you're safe. His eyes opened. Gold, the exact same molten gold as the wolf's, it hit her like a hook through the sternum. He inhaled, one long breath dragged in through his nose like he was memorizing her. Then his whole body locked. His hand shot out, closed around her wrist, not painful, absolute. Okay, personal space is a concept. Mine. The word came out wrecked, half-growled, aimed less at her than at the universe itself. I'm sorry, what? I know you, his grip tightened, desperate not cruel. I don't know how, I don't know why, but I've known you my whole life. You've known me for 6 hours, most of which you spent unconscious and bleeding on my floor. It's not the fever. It is very likely the fever. I would know, he said, my wolf would know. And that was the exact moment the old scars across her back, 4 faint silver lines she'd carried since before memory began, the ones every healer had ever called wrong, began, very suddenly, to burn. Not itch. Burn, white-hot, spreading, like something buried 11 years had just cracked its eyes open. Wren gasped, her hand. He didn't let go of her wrist, not right away. Let go, Wren said, or I start reconsidering the whole saving your life thing. He let go, fast, like he hadn't realized his own grip. I'm sorry, he said, that's never happened before, any of it. Which part, the growling, or the part where you called me yours like it was already decided? He didn't answer that. Which was an answer. You need to leave, Wren said. I need to leave, he agreed, and didn't move an inch. She studied him, the fever flush along his cheekbones, the too fast rise and fall of his chest, the sheer, absurd size of him crammed into her small cottage like a bear that had wandered into a birdcage. You need to leave, she said again. I need to leave, he said again. I intend to, the moment I'm no longer at risk of dying on your floor, which, given my ribs, is not happening in the next hour. Possibly not the next day. He said it like a man laying out simple facts, not negotiating. You have my word I won't touch you again without permission, but I'm not walking out that door with 3 cracked ribs and a fever this high. And I don't think you actually want me to, or you'd have shoved me out already instead of arguing about it. She opened her mouth to deliver something blistering. Found she didn't have one. He wasn't wrong, that was somehow worse. Fine, she said with as much dignity as she could scrape together. You stay until the fever breaks, not 1 hour longer, and you're going to answer some questions while you're at it. Fair terms, a pause, what's your name? Why does that matter? Because I'd like to know what to call the woman who dragged me out of a river and then spent an hour arguing with me about leaving her floor. Wren. Wren, he said it slow, turned the word over like he was testing its weight. I'm Kane. She didn't like how much she liked hearing him say it. Well, Kane, she said, rising, putting several very necessary feet between them, try not to die in the next 20 minutes. I need to feed my chickens. I refuse to come back to a corpse. The paperwork alone would ruin my week. She was fairly certain, though she'd deny it under oath, that he laughed on her way out. Low, rough, entirely too pleased with himself. Sable arrived a little past noon, soaked to the knees, radiating fury. There'd better be a very good reason, she announced, shoving through the door without knocking, that half the village is saying you dragged a dying man out of the hush last night, because if you tell me you finally decided to start courting someone, I am going to. She stopped. Dead. Her gaze landed on the man sitting, very much awake now, very much shirtless, very much taking up an unreasonable amount of space in front of the hearth. Every trace of color drained out of her face. I know who that is, Sable said, flat, careful, the tone she only ever used over the worst wounds. That's Kane Duskryder. Kane inclined his head, unbothered on the surface, though his eyes had sharpened at the sound of her voice. You have me at a disadvantage. I don't believe we've met. We haven't, Sable's jaw stayed tight, but I know your pack, Duskryder territory, you're the alpha. Guilty. You are aware, Sable said, turning on Wren, that the Duskryder pack has been at war with Shadow Wolf raiders for the better part of a year. that anyone caught helping a Duskryder, or being helped by one, becomes a target the second word gets out. Wren's stomach dropped straight through her boots. Nobody had mentioned that part. I would have, Kane said, entirely too calm, if I'd managed to stay conscious for more than 10 consecutive minutes since last night. That's fair, Wren admitted, then turned back to Sable, brow furrowing. Wait, how do you know all this? You've never once mentioned knowing anything about pack politics beyond stay well clear of them. Where does a healer who treats farmers and goats learn the standing of a war between two shifter packs? Something flickered behind Sable's eyes. They're gone. Wren nearly missed it, would have, if she hadn't spent a decade learning every one of her friends tells the way other people learned scripture. I trained under a healer who worked the northern circuits, Sable said, smooth, practiced, the kind of answer that had clearly been rehearsed long before it was ever needed. You hear things moving between territories, which packs are feuding. Which borders aren't safe, it's the sort of knowledge that keeps a wandering healer alive. She held Wren's gaze, daring her to push further. I've simply never had reason to mention it. We don't get many wounded alphas washing up on our riverbank. It was a perfectly reasonable explanation. It also didn't sit right. Not entirely, not in the place behind Wren's ribs where instinct lived, the same place that had known, without being told, exactly how to pull silver out of a dying wolf. But Sable had already crossed the room, already peeling back the linen at Kane's ribs with brisk, professional hands, and the moment for pressing had passed. These need to be redressed properly, Sable said. Whoever patched these did competent work under terrible conditions, but he needs willow bark for the fever, 3 more days off his feet. Or he's going to tear these stitches wide open the first time he tries anything heroic. I have a war to return to, Kane said. You have a punctured lung waiting to happen is what you have. Sable didn't miss a beat. The war can survive 3 days without you. I promise the Shadow Wolves aren't so disciplined they'll pause their raiding schedule to wait for your convenience. Wren, despite everything, smothered a laugh. I like her, Kane said dryly, glancing over Sable's shoulder. Is she always this pleasant? She's being unusually gentle with you, actually. You should see what she does to men who complain about stitches. I heard that, Sable said, not looking up. The afternoon wore on that way, Sable working with quick, sure hands, Kane submitting to it with far more grace than Wren would have expected from a man snarling about a war an hour before, Wren herself hovering at the edges, restless, watching the two of them with the growing, uneasy sense that there was a conversation happening beneath the one she could actually hear. She was still turning that over when the door opened again. No knock this time, no pause. A second man filled the frame, tall, grim-faced, rain-soaked and travel-worn. His eyes swept the room with the sharp focus of a soldier walking into unfamiliar territory. His gaze found Kane first. Relief. Then his gaze found Wren. And every trace of that relief drained away, replaced by something that looked unmistakably like shock. Ashgrave, Kane pushed himself upright despite Sable's sharp protest. You made good time. Ashgrave didn't answer. Didn't so much as glance at his alpha. His eyes stayed locked on Wren, wide, stricken, one hand gripping the doorframe hard enough the wood groaned. Ashgrave, Kane sharper now, what is it? The commander's throat worked once, twice. It can't be her, he breathed, so quiet Wren nearly missed it beneath the crackle of the fire. Can't be who? Kane demanded. Ashgrave's eyes finally tore away from Wren, found Kane instead. Whatever he saw there seemed to cost him something. She died 11 years ago, he said. The room went dead silent. Somebody out there had a face that matched a ghost, and Wren was about to find out exactly whose. Chapter 3: The Scars That Don't Heal Right. The words landed in the small cottage like a stone dropped into still water. Nobody moved to disturb the ripples. Say that again, Kane said finally, very quiet, the tone of a man who has heard something he refuses to have understood correctly. Ashgrave's hand was still white-knuckled against the doorframe. His eyes hadn't left Wren once. I said it can't be her. Can't be who, Ashgrave? Kane's voice sharpened, the wounded softness from the morning burning away into something harder. You walk into this room, take one look at the woman who saved my life, and tell me she's dead. I would very much like an explanation. Ashgrave's throat worked. His gaze finally tore away from Wren, found Kane instead. It's nothing, a resemblance. I apologize, it's been a long ride, I'm not thinking clearly. That is the worst lie I have heard from you in 11 years of service. Kane. Try again. Ashgrave's jaw clenched. For a moment it looked like he might actually refuse, turn on his heel, walk back into the rain rather than finish the sentence. Then visibly, he mastered himself, drew his composure back up around him like a soldier squaring his shoulders before a charge. It's nothing that can't wait, he said, steadier now though the color hadn't fully returned to his face. You need rest more than you need my ghost stories. We'll speak when you're stronger. Ashgrave. When you're stronger, Kane. His voice cracked like a whip, sharp enough that even Sable's hand stilled at Kane's ribs. I have ridden 2 days through flooded roads to find you bleeding out on a border healer's floor. I am not having this conversation until I know you're not about to fall over. Rest, please. He left before Kane could argue further, the door swinging shut hard enough to rattle the shutters. The silence that followed was its own kind of loud. Sable left not long after, pulled Wren aside at the well, grip on her arm hard enough to bruise. Don't trust him with everything, she said, eyes darting toward the cottage like the walls themselves might be listening. Not yet, please, Wren, some things are safer left buried. That's not even slightly ominous. Wren's stomach had gone tight and cold. Sable, what is going on? First Ashgrave looks at me like I crawled out of a grave. Now you're telling me to keep secrets from a man who's been bleeding on my floor for a full day. What am I supposed to be hiding when I don't even know what the secret is? I don't know everything either, Sable said, and for once that had the ring of truth to it. But I know enough to be frightened. I need you to trust me a little longer, please. She was gone before Wren could press further, disappearing down the muddy road at a pace bordering on flight. Wren stood alone at the well a long moment, rain misting cold against her skin, feeling more unmoored than she had in years. She was still turning it over hours later, long after dark. Kane caught her staring into a cooling bowl of stew like it might hold answers if she looked hard enough. You've been somewhere else for the better part of an hour, he said. Where? Nowhere. The lie came out badly, she knew it the moment it left her mouth. Kane set down his own spoon, deliberate, the care of a man handling something breakable. Wren. It's fine. It's very clearly not, or you wouldn't be gripping that bowl like it's personally insulted your family. She let out a long breath, frustration and exhaustion tangling together until she set the bowl down before she genuinely cracked it. Your commander looked at me this morning like he'd seen a ghost. Sable pulled me aside and told me not to trust you with, I don't even know what, everything, apparently. She dragged a hand through her hair. I have lived on this border 11 years, Kane. I have never once had this much mystery attached to my name in my entire life. And suddenly, in the space of one storm, I've got 2 people looking at me like I'm a secret nobody bothered to tell me I was keeping. Kane was quiet a long moment. Too long, the kind of quiet with weight to it, pressing against her chest like a held breath. Show me your back, he said finally. Wren blinked. Excuse me. Your scars, the ones beneath your collar, I caught a glimpse of one this morning when you were changing my bandages. Silver pale, old. His voice had gone very careful, very level. Show me, please. Her hand rose instinctively to her own shoulder, fingers finding the raised, silvery ridge of scar tissue through her dress without needing to look, the way her hand had found that spot 1,000 quiet nights before, never once suspecting the marks meant anything. They're old, she said. Healers have looked at them dozens of times. Nobody's ever explained what made them. I might be able to. Something in his voice, low, certain, threaded through with a grief she didn't yet understand. Slowly, deliberately, she turned in her chair, drew her collar down over one shoulder, let the firelight fall across marks she'd carried as long as memory allowed, 4 parallel lines, silver-white, radiating out from her shoulder blade like something had raked its claws through skin and left starlight behind instead of blood. Kane went very, very still. Say something, Wren said when the silence stretched past bearing. You're supposed to be the one with answers here. He rose from his chair slowly, favoring his ribs, crossed the small room until he stood close enough she could feel the warmth off him, that persistent fever heat that never quite seemed to fade. He didn't touch her at first, only looked, gold eyes tracing the marks like he was reading a language only he'd been taught. Then, gently, so gently it nearly undid her, he pressed 2 fingers to the edge of one scar. Shadow wolves mark children, he said quietly, before certain rituals, his jaw tightened, before they're used for something, the marks are meant to fade once the ritual completes. When they don't fade. When they don't fade, what? It means the ritual was interrupted. His hand hadn't moved, his voice had dropped lower, rougher, furious on her behalf in a way that made her chest ache. It means someone got you out before whatever they intended could finish. Wren drew her collar back up, suddenly cold despite the fire. That's insane. I wish it were. I don't have a family, Kane. I don't have a pack. I don't have anything before I was 12 except a river and a healer who found me half drowned on its banks, and never once in over a decade mentioned shadow wolves, or rituals. Or any of this. Her voice cracked on the last word. She hated how thin and frightened it sounded. I built this whole life out of nothing. I am not going to let you hand me some tragic bloodline out of a bad campfire story just because my scars happen to frighten you. They don't frighten me. His hand rose, cupped her jaw with a tenderness that stole the breath clean out of her lungs. Nothing about you frightens me, Wren. That's precisely the problem. My wolf took one look at you and decided you were his before either of us had the slightest say in it. And now I cannot stop thinking that whatever happened to you 11 years ago might be tangled up in the same night that took everything from me. What happened to you? Something in his eyes went dark, old, grief-worn. 11 years ago, he said, shadow wolves razed my family's stronghold to the ground. My parents, The door slammed open hard enough to crack against the wall. Sable stood in the frame, soaked through for the second time that day, chest heaving, eyes wide with a fear Wren had never once seen on her in 10 years of friendship. Shadow wolves, Sable gasped, at the border, a whole pack of them moving fast, her gaze locked onto Wren's, an entire decade of careful secrecy cracking wide open in a single ragged breath. They're not just raiding Wren. They're asking for someone by name. What name? Kane's voice had gone dangerously flat, already shifting from wounded man back into something harder. Sable's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. Ilara. The name meant nothing to Wren. It meant everything to the way every trace of color drained from Kane's face. And it meant everything to the way her own scars, silent for hours, started all at once to burn. Chapter 4, the name I never answered to. There wasn't time to ask what the name meant. There wasn't time for anything at all. The night split open with the frantic clang of the village bell. Past the tree line, wolves that weren't Kane began to howl, a sound with none of the morning cadence of a wolf's usual cry, only hunger, purpose. The terrible patience of hunters who already knew they'd found their prey. Stay behind me, Kane said, already moving for the door, already shrugging the last softness of the wounded man off his shoulders like a coat he no longer had patience to wear. I'm a healer, not a liability. I know exactly what you are. That is precisely why I need you breathing. He caught her face in both hands, one fierce, fleeting second, gold eyes blazing bright even in the gloom. Behind me, please, Wren, I am asking, not commanding. Then he was gone. Not the man, the wolf, black fur rippling up over cracking bone in a transformation that should have taken long, agonized minutes and instead took seconds, fever-driven and furious, tearing out into the storm-wrecked dark with a snarl that shook the shutters loose. Wren grabbed her satchel and ran after him anyway. Because apparently that was simply who she was now. The village had already dissolved into chaos. Shapes moved between the cottages, wolves with wrong-colored eyes, matted fur, a hunger in their movements that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with malice. Duskryder warriors cut through them with the grim, practiced efficiency of soldiers who'd done this exact bloody work 100 times before, but there were too many attackers, and the rain had turned every path treacherous underfoot. Wren dropped beside a fallen warrior, hands already moving on instinct, pressing linen hard against a wound gaping wide at his throat. You're fine, breathe for me, stay with me. Well. The voice came from directly behind her, silk smooth, delighted. It turned her stomach cold before she'd even finished turning to face it. A shadow wolf stood a few paces off, caught in half shift, more monster now than man, matted fur bristling along a spine bent at a wrong angle. Little princess, he crooned, stepping closer through the mud with unhurried, predatory grace, do you have any idea how long we've looked for you? I have no idea what you're talking about. Wren backed away, one hand closing around the only weapon she carried, a healer's scalpel, absurdly small against something built entirely for killing. And I'd very much like to keep it that way, thank you. That's precious, he lunged. Wren didn't decide what happened next. There was no strategy in it, no thought at all, only pure animal terror and the scars across her back suddenly blazing white-hot and then light, actual physical light, gold and furious, tearing out of her chest like something that had spent 11 long years simply waiting for permission. The shadow wolf screamed. The light struck him like a physical blow, scorching fur and flesh in an instant, throwing his body backward into the mud in a smoking, unmoving heap. The world tilted sideways. Wren's knees hit the ground. Everything went dark. She woke to warmth, the smell of wood smoke, Kane's voice raw, wrecked, closer to breaking than she'd heard it even in the worst hour of his fever. Please, please, come back, I can't lose you, not now, not like this. I'm here, she rasped. His whole body shuddered against her, his arms closed around her like he feared the wind itself might steal her the moment he let go. You scared me half to death, his voice was thick against her hair. I felt your heartbeat stop through the bond, Wren, do you understand what that? What bond? He pulled back just far enough to look at her properly. Whatever he saw in her face made him go quiet, careful again, folding the raw terror back down beneath a composure she was beginning to recognize as armor. Later, he said, first, Sable. Sable sat across the room, hands wrapped white-knuckled around a cup of tea she hadn't touched, her face gray with something that looked a great deal like guilt finally catching up to a decade of careful running. Tell her, Kane said, tell her now, or I will, and I promise you won't like how I choose to say it. Sable's hands trembled around the cup. 11 years ago, she began, I found a child in the river, not drowned, dying but not drowned, marked. Her eyes lifted to Wren's, wet and pleading. I raised you as my own because the alternative was handing you back to whoever had put those marks on you in the first place. I would not do that. You knew, Wren's voice came out very quiet, this whole time. I knew you weren't safe, I didn't know what you were, not fully, not then. Sable's voice cracked clean through. I still don't know everything. I only knew that if anyone ever truly found you, everything I built to keep you hidden would burn down around us both. Wren's hands had begun, very slightly, to shake. She looked down at them, steady hands, capable hands, a healer's hands, and thought of gold light tearing out of her own chest like something finally set loose. Wren, Kane's voice low, careful, achingly gentle. Whatever you are, whatever this is, it doesn't change. Kane Duskryder. The name tore loose from somewhere Wren didn't recognize in herself, somewhere buried and screaming to be heard at last, a name she had never once spoken aloud and somehow already knew the exact shape of in her own mouth. That's who they were asking for, that's who they think I. Kane went white as bone. That, he said, voice barely above a whisper, was my sister's name. She'd just found out her whole life was a stolen name. And the man who'd claimed her as his mate might, impossibly, be her brother. Chapter 5, The Sister I'm Not. Nobody spoke for a long moment. The fire popped and spat in the hearth, sending up a brief shower of sparks. Wren watched them die in the dark and thought, with the strange, detached clarity of a mind trying to protect itself, that she would very much like to trade places with them. Say that again, she said, finally, because I think I misheard you. I need you to say it again so I can be certain I'm not the one losing my mind tonight. Ilara, Kane's voice had gone hollow, stripped down to the raw shape of a grief 11 years old and never once properly allowed to heal. My sister. She was 2 years old the night the shadow wolves came. I was 17. I was supposed to be watching the west gate. His hands curled into fists against his knees, knuckles whitening. I was 17 years old and I let them take her, and I have spent every single year since telling myself she died quickly. That she didn't suffer long, that there was nothing at all I could have done. Kane. My wolf hasn't let anyone close in 11 years, he said, looking directly at her now, gold eyes wrecked and furious and terrified all at once. Not one single person, not a potential mate in over a decade. I told myself it was simply grief, that I hadn't recovered, that perhaps I never would, and then I woke up on your floor and every instinct I possessed screamed mate before I'd even managed to open my eyes properly. His jaw worked hard. Do you understand what I'm saying to you, Wren? I understand exactly what you're saying. Her voice came out far smaller than she intended, and I would very much like you to stop saying it. If you're her, then whatever this is, Wren said, gesturing helplessly between them at the space that had felt charged and impossible and inexplicably right since the very first gold-eyed glance he'd given her, is the single most horrifying thing either of us has ever done. And I would like to formally request that the universe take it back immediately. Agreed, Kane said, with the particular grim humor of a man standing at the edge of a cliff and laughing only because the alternative was screaming. Wholeheartedly, entirely agreed. Sable made a small, strangled sound from her corner of the room, something caught between a sob and a laugh. Both of them turned toward her at once. This isn't funny, Wren said. It's not, Sable agreed at once. I promise you it's genuinely not. She pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. I have spent 11 years dreading precisely this conversation. I find I need one moment before I ruin both your lives even further than I already have. You can't ruin it further, Kane said darkly. I believe we've reached the ceiling of how ruined a single evening can become. He was wrong, though none of them knew it yet. Because that was the exact moment Commander Ashgrave arrived, soaked entirely through, his face the color of old ash, and the look he gave Kane from the doorway was not the look of a man who had merely tracked his alphas sent across a war zone. It was the look of a man walking, of his own accord, toward his own execution. Kane, Ashgrave said, I need to speak with you, alone. No, Kane didn't so much as glance at him. Whatever it is, you'll say it here. Kane. Say it here, Ashgrave. I am done being handled tonight. Ashgrave's throat worked visibly. For one long moment it looked as though he might genuinely refuse, might turn and walk back out into the rain and never speak another word of it as long as he lived. Then something in him seemed to simply break. The same slow, inevitable collapse Wren had watched happen to Sable barely an hour before, a decade of guarded silence finally giving way beneath its own accumulated weight. I was on the West Gate that night, Ashgrave said, with you. I know I was there. No, Ashgrave's voice cracked clean through the middle. You weren't, not for the part that matters. You were pulled to the east wall when the second wave struck. You never saw what happened at the nursery. I was the one posted outside Alara's door. I was 17 years old and terrified, and I left my post for 4 minutes to help fight a fire tearing through the west wing, and when I came back, he stopped, forced himself to continue. When I came back, she was already gone, and I have told myself every single day since that 4 minutes couldn't possibly have mattered, that they would have taken her regardless of anything I did or didn't do, that it wasn't my fault. The room had gone utterly, perfectly silent. I let your sister be taken, Ashgrave said, and I have spent 11 years too much of a coward to ever tell you, because I was afraid of exactly what's sitting in that chair right now, the possibility that she survived after all, that she is sitting 3 feet away from you at this very moment, and that I am the entire reason neither of you carries a single memory of the other. Kane didn't move, didn't speak. His whole body had gone rigid as carved stone. When he finally did move, it was slow, deliberate, terrifyingly controlled. The particular kind of control Wren was beginning to understand meant he stood one single heartbeat from losing it entirely. Get out, he said quietly. Kane. Get out, Ashgrave, before I do something we will both spend the rest of our lives regretting. Ashgrave went, the door shut behind him with a soft, final click. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Wren had ever sat inside of. She looked at Kane, at the grief carved fresh across a face that had clearly spent 11 years learning how to hide it well, felt the ghost of his hand still warm against her jaw from an hour before, felt the impossible, magnetic pull that had nothing whatsoever to do with logic or comfort or sense. Kane, she said carefully, I need you to look at me. He did, gold eyes wrecked, glassy, holding hers as though she were the only solid thing left standing in a world that had just come apart entirely at the seams. Whatever this bond is, Wren said, it does not feel like family. I don't know what a sibling bond is meant to feel like. I've never had one to measure it against, but I know with absolute certainty that it isn't supposed to feel like this. Her voice shook and she let it. It isn't supposed to make my whole chest ache the moment you leave a room. It isn't supposed to feel like drowning. I know, Kane said hoarse. I feel it too, and that terrifies me more than anything else tonight has managed to, because if you are my sister, then we're both about to discover exactly how much worse this particular night can still get. Neither of them said anything further for a long moment. The fire burned low. Outside, the storm had finally, mercifully passed, leaving nothing behind but dripping eaves and a silence too heavy for either of them to lift alone. It was Sable who broke it at last. Sable still curled small in her corner of the room, tears tracking silent down her face, voice barely above a whisper when she finally spoke the words she'd swallowed whole for 11 unbroken years. She's not your sister, Kane. Both their heads snapped toward her at once. What? Kane's voice had gone dangerously soft. Sable closed her eyes, bracing herself against a blow she'd spent over a decade dodging. I need to tell you what really happened that night, she said. All of it this time, because I believe I know exactly where Wren Duskryder actually is, and it isn't sitting in this room with us. Chapter 6: What Sable Buried. For a long moment, nobody moved. The fire popped once, sending a brief spray of sparks up the chimney. Wren watched them die in the dark and thought, distantly, that she would very much like to trade places with them. Sable, she said slowly, if the next sentence out of your mouth is another 11-year-old secret, I need you to know that my heart genuinely cannot take it tonight. I've had a very long evening. I got set on fire from the inside out by my own skin. I would like, at bare minimum, a cup of tea before the next revelation lands on me. There's no time for tea, Sable said, and the raw fear threading through her voice killed whatever half-formed joke Wren had been building toward. Please, just let me say this before I lose my nerve entirely. Kane's jaw was tight enough to crack walnuts. Talk. Sable set down her cup, hands still visibly trembling. For the first time since Wren had known her, a full decade of shared meals and stitched wounds and quiet, steady friendship, she looked genuinely, thoroughly afraid. 11 years ago I wasn't a border healer, Sable said. I was the Duskryder pack healer, on duty the night of the raid. Kane went very still. I don't remember you. You wouldn't. I kept to the infirmary wing, mostly. Alphas rarely bother learning the names of the people who only matter to them when they're already bleeding. A ghost of old bitterness colored her voice before she visibly swallowed it back down. That night everything came apart at once. Fire tearing through the east wing, raiders breaching the gate, the nursery overrun before anyone could organize a proper defense. I was running toward the wounded when I heard something at the edge of the river, well past the tree line, well past anywhere a soul should have been at that hour. Ilara, Kane said, barely a breath of sound. No, Sable shook her head, and something in the gesture made Wren's stomach drop before the next words had even fully arrived. I found a child, yes, but not your sister, a different infant. Younger, I think, though it was difficult to tell given the state she was in. Marked, bleeding, left at the water's edge like something discarded rather than something merely lost. Her eyes lifted, wet and terrified, to find Wren's across the room. I have spent 11 years telling myself I didn't fully understand what those marks meant. I did. I'd seen Shadowwolf ritual scarring before, on healers who hadn't survived long enough afterward to warn anyone else about it. I knew precisely what I was holding in my arms, and I ran anyway. I didn't take her to the pack healers. I didn't report what I'd found to a single soul. I simply ran and kept running and raised her as far from anything Duskryder or Shadowwolf as I possibly could, because the only alternative I could see was handing an infant back to whatever wanted her badly enough to carve marks into skin that small. The room had gone so quiet Wren could hear her own pulse hammering in her ears. Are you telling me, she said, very carefully, testing each word before she let it leave her mouth, that I am not Wren Duskryder? I am telling you I don't know with certainty who you are, Sable said. I only know with certainty who you are not. You were never Kane's sister. You were someone else's child entirely, someone from a Shadowwolf bloodline, someone marked for a ritual I still don't fully understand even now, someone I stole out of the dark because I could not stand the thought of walking away and leaving you there. Her voice cracked entirely down the middle. I named you Wren because it seemed harmless, small, nothing anyone passing through would think twice about. I am so sorry I never told you the truth. I told myself every single year that passed that waiting one more year would somehow be safer than the year before it. I was wrong every single time I made that choice. Wren sat with that for a long moment, feeling something enormous and complicated settle slowly into her chest. Relief first, sharp and immediate, that whatever this was between her and Kane wasn't the horror they'd both spent the last hour bracing themselves against. And beneath that relief, slower and considerably heavier, grief, for an identity she'd never even known she was missing, layered thick over a decade of loving a woman who had lied to her, gently but completely, every single day in the name of keeping her alive. So if I'm not Ilara, she said slowly, then where is she? Silence answered her. Kane's face had moved through several expressions in rapid succession. Devastation, disbelief, something achingly close to hope, before settling finally on something raw and entirely unguarded that Wren hadn't yet seen from him in the whole of their short, strange acquaintance. She might still be alive, he said, as though the words themselves were dangerous to speak too loudly, in case saying them aloud somehow broke the fragile possibility they carried. If the shadow wolves took her that night instead of killing her outright. Then she has been raised among them for 11 years, Sable finished quietly, which means if she is alive, she is very likely not the sister you remember anymore. Kane didn't answer that, couldn't perhaps. His hands had curled back into fists, knuckles white, old grief and fresh, dangerous hope tangled together into something that looked as though it might tear him apart from the inside if he let it sit unattended for too long. Wren reached over without entirely deciding to, and covered one of his fists with her hand. Slowly, his fingers uncurled beneath hers. He turned his palm upward and laced their fingers together like a man reaching for the nearest solid thing in a room that had stopped making sense. "I'm sorry," she said softly, "about your sister, about all of it." "Don't," his voice came out rough, "don't apologize for something that was never yours to carry in the first place." His thumb traced slow, absent circles against her knuckles. When he finally looked up at her, the relief in his gold eyes was so raw it stole the breath clean out of her chest. "You're not my sister." "No. You're my mate." "That does appear to be the situation, yes." Her voice came out considerably less steady than she'd intended, because now that the horror of the last hour had finally lifted, everything underneath it, the pull, the ache, the impossible gravity that had been quietly building since the very moment his eyes first opened gold and fixed on hers, came rushing back in at full force, with nothing left standing in the way to hold it back. Kane's free hand rose to cup her jaw, achingly gentle, thumb brushing along her cheekbone the same way it had before the entire evening had gone sideways. "I have spent 11 years believing I would never let myself want anything this much again," he said quietly, "because everything I have ever truly loved I have eventually lost. And I am terrified, genuinely, thoroughly terrified, of exactly how much I already want to keep you." "That is either the single most romantic thing anyone has ever said to me," Wren whispered, "or an enormous red flag, and I currently lack the emotional bandwidth to determine which." "Both," Kane said, something that was almost a real smile ghosted briefly across his mouth. "Very likely both, if I'm honest with you." He kissed her then, slow, careful, as though he were asking permission with every fraction of the movement, giving her every possible chance to pull away before it went any further. She didn't pull away, she leaned into it instead, into him, into the warmth and the impossible certainty of it. Months of quiet loneliness and 11 years of never quite belonging anywhere dissolving into something that finally felt like it fit properly. Sable made a small, watery sound that might have been a sob, might have been a laugh. Neither of them broke apart long enough to check which. It might have gone on longer still, might have become something neither of them was fully ready yet to name. If the night hadn't chosen that exact moment to shatter apart around them. A horn split the darkness outside, low and long and utterly unmistakable as a war call, answered a single heartbeat later by a full chorus of howls that had nothing whatsoever to do with grief and everything to do with the hunt. Kane went rigid against her, every trace of softness burning instantly away into something hard, alert, and lethal. "That's not a raiding party," he said, already rising, already reaching for whatever strength still remained to him. "That's an army." Sable's face had gone bone white. "They know," she whispered. "Somehow they already know exactly where she is." Outside, the horn sounded again, closer this time, close enough that Wren felt the low note of it in her back teeth. And beneath her collar, beneath 11 years of buried, silvered scars, something ancient and marked and never quite finished began, once again, to burn. Chapter 7, Until Dawn. By the time Wren reached the door, satchel forgotten, heart hammering somewhere up near her throat, the village had already begun transforming into something out of a nightmare. Torches guttered wild against a tree line thick with shapes that moved wrong, too many joints, too much silence for creatures of that size, closing in from every direction at once like a net drawing slowly shut. And at the front of them, standing in the churned mud as though he owned the very ground beneath his boots, was a man in shadow-black armor with a smile that made Wren's skin crawl before he'd spoken a single word. Kane Duskryder, his voice carried easy and cold across the distance, unhurried, almost pleasant. "It's been a long time." Vosk, Kane's voice beside her, had dropped into something Wren had never once heard from him, flat, lethal, utterly stripped of warmth. "You have a great deal of nerve, showing your face on this side of the border." "I have exactly as much nerve as I require." Vosk's gaze slid past Kane, found Wren, lingered there with an interest that made her want to set him on fire properly this time, no accidents, no half measures. "Ah, there she is. Do you have any idea how much trouble you've caused me, little princess? 11 years spent searching, and you were hiding the whole time in a border village, playing healer to farmers and their goats. I genuinely have no idea what you're talking about, Wren said, forcing steel into her voice she didn't fully feel, but I would like to formally register how much I dislike your tone. Vosk laughed, a dry, humorless sound with no real mirth behind it. Feisty, I like that in her. It'll make what comes next considerably more interesting. Say whatever it is you came here to say, Kane cut in, stepping half in front of Wren without seeming to notice he'd done it. And then get off my border before I decide diplomacy isn't worth the breath it costs me. Very well, Vosk spread his hands, magnanimous, a man delivering terms he already fully expected to win. She was bred for a purpose, Alpha, something generations in the making. We lost her before the binding could complete, which is the only reason she's standing there arguing with me instead of already serving the purpose she was made for. His eyes gleamed, dark and hungry. That gold light your mate used on my scout 2 nights past, a fraction, the barest whisper of what she becomes once the ritual finishes what it started all those years ago. Wren's stomach turned to ice. That is not happening. It doesn't require your willingness, Vosk said, almost gently, almost kind, which was somehow worse than open cruelty would have been. Hand her over, Kane, and I leave your pack in peace tonight. Refuse me and I burn this village to the waterline and take her from the ashes regardless. He smiled wider. Your choice changes nothing except how many of your people die alongside you before dawn. The silence that followed felt like the held breath before a blade finally fell. Let me save you some time, Kane said finally, his voice utterly terrifyingly calm. No. You haven't even considered it. I don't need to consider it. The answer was no before you finished the sentence, and it will still be no long after you've left. Try me, and find out exactly how much of your army I'm prepared to burn to keep it that way. Vosk's smile didn't waver, but something colder moved behind his eyes. Sentiment, he said, almost pitying. How very Duskryder of you, Alpha. Very well, Dawn. I'll grant you until dawn to reconsider, out of respect for old grudges between our houses. After that, I stop asking politely, and I stop caring how many bodies it takes to collect what's owed to me. He melted back into the tree line. The torches followed. The silence he left behind was somehow louder than the horn had been. We don't have until dawn, Kane said the moment the last shadow wolf vanished from sight, already turning back toward the cottage, voice clipped and urgent. Vosk doesn't make promises he intends to keep. That deadline is a courtesy to himself, not to us, time to position his forces properly before he strikes. Then what do we do? Wren's hands had curled into fists at her sides, nails biting crescents into her palms. I'm not Kane, I'm not going with him, I don't care what I was supposedly bred for. I would rather burn this entire village down myself than hand over whatever power is sitting under my skin to a man who looks at me like I'm livestock. You're not going anywhere. Kane's hand found hers, steady despite everything, grounding her in a way that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with the bond thrumming low and constant between them now. But he's right about one thing. Whatever this ritual left behind in you, it's real and it's strong enough that he's willing to march an army to reclaim it. If we're going to survive what's coming, you need every advantage we can give you. Sable, hovering near the doorway with her arms wrapped tight around herself, went very still. What are you suggesting? The mate bond. Kane's gaze didn't leave Wren's face. It isn't complete. I claimed her without meaning to, the night I woke on her floor, but claiming and completing are 2 very different things. A finished bond ties our strength together. It gives her an anchor, something to draw on besides raw, untrained power that scorches anything it touches, friend or enemy alike. You're talking about binding yourselves permanently, Sable said slowly, on the eve of a battle as a tactical decision. I'm talking about giving her a fighting chance, Kane said. The rest of it, his voice caught, just slightly, the first crack Wren had seen in his composure since the horn sounded. The rest of it isn't tactics, I want you to know that. Whatever else tonight becomes, I am not offering this bond because a war demands it of me. Wren looked at him for a long moment, at the man who had woken on her floor 3 days ago as a stranger and somehow, impossibly, become the truest thing in a life built entirely out of fragments and secrets. At the fear in his eyes that had nothing to do with Vosk's army and everything to do with the possibility that she might say no. I know, she said softly, I know exactly what you're offering, Kane, and I choose it, not because an army is coming, because I want to. Something in his face broke open entirely. They didn't speak of ceremony or ritual words or any of the traditions Wren imagined a pack might observe under gentler circumstances. There wasn't time for any of that, and somehow, standing in the small cottage with torchlight flickering gold through the windows and war drums beginning, faint and steady, somewhere past the tree line, ceremony felt beside the point entirely. Kane's hands found her face, both of them trembling slightly, his from restraint, hers from a fear that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with everything else. "Once this is done," he said quietly, "there's no undoing it, not ever. I need you to be certain." "I have never been more certain of anything in my entire life," Wren said, and found to her own quiet astonishment that it was true. "Kane, I trust you. That terrifies me more than Vosk does if I'm honest, but I trust you anyway." He kissed her then, nothing like the careful, tentative kiss from hours before. This was claiming, and devotion and desperate tenderness all tangled together into something that stole the breath clean out of her lungs. His hands sliding into her hair, hers fisting in the front of his shirt, both of them holding on like the war outside might tear them apart if they let go for even a single second. When he finally drew back, his forehead pressed to hers, his voice came out wrecked and reverent all at once. "I love you," he said. "I know it's fast. I know none of this makes sense by any measure a sane person would use, but it's true, and I need you to know it before whatever comes next." "I love you too," Wren said, and the words felt less like a confession and more like something she'd simply always known, waiting only for the right moment to be spoken aloud. "Now finish it, Kane. Before I lose my nerve or the sun comes up, whichever happens first." What followed was neither hurried nor entirely gentle. Desperate in the way that only comes from knowing morning might bring a battle neither of them was guaranteed to survive. Tender in the way that only comes from two people finally, fully choosing each other with open eyes. When his teeth finally found the curve of her shoulder, marking her the way instinct demanded, the pain of it was swallowed whole by something vast and warm and absolute flooding through her chest, the bond, completing, settling into place like a missing piece of her own body finally restored. She felt him then, not just his hands, his voice, the physical weight of him. She felt the steady, unshakable current of him running parallel to her own heartbeat, grief and hope and fierce devotion, all humming quietly at the edge of her awareness like a second pulse she would carry for the rest of her life. Afterward, tangled together in the narrow bed with dawn beginning to gray the edges of the shuttered windows, Kane pressed his lips to her temple and murmured, "Whatever happens today, that was real. Remember that no matter what comes next." "You're being ominous again." "I'm being honest," his arms tightened around her. "I intend to survive this day and every day after it for the record, but I've learned not to promise a woman I love that tomorrow is guaranteed. I'd rather she know exactly how today felt instead." Wren was still turning that thought over, equal parts terrified and steadied by it, when the ground outside shuddered under the weight of something enormous striking the outer wall. Kane was on his feet before the sound had finished rolling through the cottage, wolf already rippling beneath his skin, gold eyes gone sharp and lethal in an instant. "That's not dawn," he said grimly. Outside, the outer wall gave way with a sound like the world itself splitting open, and through the widening breach poured a tide of shadow wolves, torches and teeth alike gleaming wet in the pre-dawn gray. Kane didn't wait to see more. He was already through the door and shifting fully, black fur rippling up over cracking bone. Wren grabbed her satchel and ran out into the chaos behind him, the newly completed bond thrumming steady and warm in her chest, even as terror closed cold fingers around her throat. Whatever came next, she was no longer facing it alone. She only hoped that would be enough. Chapter 8: What the Light Cost. Dawn broke thin and gray over the wreckage of the outer wall, and with it came the sound the entire night had been building toward, not the trickle of raiders they'd faced 2 nights before, but a full assault. Wave after wave of shadow wolves pouring through the breach in numbers that made Wren's chest tighten with something close to panic. She fell into rhythm anyway, because panic was a luxury the wounded couldn't afford her. She dragged fallen warriors clear of the worst of the fighting, pressed linen hard against wounds that wouldn't stop bleeding, worked with the same steady, practiced focus that had carried her through every crisis of her adult life, only now beneath her hands she could feel the bond humming warm and constant. Kane's presence a steady anchor, even when she couldn't see him through the chaos of fur and steel and mud. "Left flank," she gasped once, to a young Duskryder warrior stumbling past with a gash torn along his ribs. "There's 3 more wounded behind that overturned cart, go." She didn't wait to see if he obeyed before turning to the next body, the next wound, the next desperate fight to keep someone's blood inside their skin where it belonged. She was elbow-deep in exactly that work, pressing a torn strip of her own skirt hard against a gash at a warrior's thigh when the fighting around her seemed to pause. all at once. Like the whole battlefield had drawn one collective breath and held it. Wren looked up. Vosk's forces had parted at the breach, clearing a path with the deliberate theater of soldiers who knew exactly how to make an entrance matter, and through that gap stepped a figure in shadow-black armor that fit her like a second skin. The woman was young, younger than Wren, though the cold, unyielding set of her jaw made her look older than her years. Dark hair pulled back severe from a face carved from precisely the same sharp, striking angles as Kane's. Her eyes swept the battlefield with the flat, assessing focus of someone who had been trained since infancy to see a field of the wounded as nothing more than a tactical map. Then her eyes found Kane. And stopped. Kane had gone rigid where he stood, wolf half-shifted back into the shape of a man, breath catching on something that sounded almost like a name he hadn't dared say aloud in 11 years. Ilara. The young woman's expression didn't so much as flicker. I don't know that name, she said, cold and flat. You do? Kane's voice cracked down the middle, grief and fury tangled together into something raw. I have looked for you every single day for 11 years. I was 17, Ilara. I was supposed to be guarding the west gate, and I have never once stopped. That's a lie, she said, and this time the tremor beneath the flatness was impossible to miss, a hairline crack running straight through 11 years of careful conditioning, that you abandoned me. That you let the shadow wolves take me because a broken pack line was an acceptable loss, that you never once looked for me. Enough, Vosk's voice cut through the standoff like a blade, sharp and commanding. Ilara, focus, the woman is the objective, everything else is noise designed to slow you down. Something flickered across Ilara's face, hesitation quick and buried fast, but Wren caught it all the same, the way you catch the first hairline crack in ice before it gives way entirely. There was no more time to study it. The battlefield surged back into motion all at once, shadow wolves pressing forward in a renewed wave, and Wren was forced backward into the fighting. Satchel forgotten. Instinct alone keeping her upright as chaos closed back in around her. The battle had narrowed by mid-morning into something closer to a slow, grinding slaughter than a clean fight. Both sides too exhausted to retreat, too desperate to stop. Wren had long since abandoned any pretense of staying safely behind the lines. She moved between the wounded wherever she could reach them. Twice now she'd felt the strange, electric prickle of her own power rising unbidden at the edge of her skin whenever danger pressed too close. Gold light flickering faint and uncertain along her palms before guttering out again, as though her body hadn't yet decided whether it trusted her to wield it. She was still turning that half-formed thought over, should I use it, can I control it, what happens if I try and it goes wrong, when she felt it. Not heard, felt, a lurch through the bond in her chest, sudden and violent like a rope drawn taut and then savagely yanked. She turned in time to see the flash of silver. Vosk's blade found Kane's side in a single, brutal motion. A strike meant for her, she understood in the same instant. A killing blow aimed at the woman he wanted, redirected at the last possible second toward the man who'd thrown himself into its path instead. Kane's body folded sideways into the mud, and the warm, steady current of him in her chest, alive since the moment he'd claimed her, unbroken through every hour since, began horribly to gutter. No. The word tore out of her raw and ragged. She was moving before she'd consciously decided to, dropping to her knees in the churned mud beside him, hands already pressing hard against the wound at his side where dark blood welled far too fast, far too much of it soaking through everything. His eyes found hers, glassy, the gold gone dim at the edges like a lamp burning down toward nothing. His lips moved without sound behind them, and through the bond she felt it anyway, not words, only feeling. I'm sorry and don't, and I love you tangled together and fading fast, like a tide pulling back from shore. Around them the battle raged on, distant now, unimportant, the entire world narrowed down to the failing pulse beneath her palms. Don't you dare, Wren said. And something in her chest cracked open wide, not the wild, uncontrolled burst of light that had scorched a shadow wolf on the very first night, something else entirely, something that felt less like breaking and more like remembering, an old shape her body had known long before her mind ever caught up to it. Sable's voice echoed suddenly in her memory, soft and half-forgotten from some quiet conversation weeks before any of this began. I've always believed the marks weren't only meant to make a weapon. Ritual magic cuts both ways if you let it. Wren closed her eyes and for the first time in her life stopped fighting the power rising in her. She let it flood up through her chest and down her arms and into her hands. Gold light blooming bright and steady where her palms pressed against Kane's wound. Not scorching this time. Mending. It cost her everything she had. She felt herself hollowing out even as the light poured from her, felt her own pulse stutter in sympathy with the effort, some ancient balance woven into the ritual magic demanding payment in the very same currency it offered. Still she didn't stop because stopping meant losing him, and she had known him only days and could not, would not, imagine a world that didn't have him standing furious and gentle and impossibly hers in it. "Come back," she whispered, gold light searing bright between her fingers. Come back, I am not finished with you yet." Somewhere beyond the light, she was distantly aware of a second voice screaming. Younger, cracking with a horror that had nothing to do with the battle and everything to do with watching a stranger nearly die to save a brother she'd been raised not to remember loving. Ilara had gone still on the battlefield, shadow-black armor forgotten, staring at Wren's light with an expression slowly, visibly cracking apart at its center, 11 years of careful conditioning splitting under the weight of something her body recognized even after her mind had been taught, patiently and thoroughly, to deny it. "That's not possible," Ilara breathed. "The ritual, she was meant to be a weapon, not." "Finish her before the bond stabilizes," Vosk snapped, already moving, already reaching for a second blade, or none of this was worth. He never finished the sentence. Ilara moved first, faster than thought, faster than her own hesitation could catch up to her, and drove her blade through the man who had raised her, the man who had told her 100 careful lies about the family that had supposedly abandoned her, the man whose grip on her mind finally, completely shattered the instant she watched a stranger nearly die to save the brother she'd spent a lifetime being taught to hate. Vosk fell. The Shadow Wolf lines wavered, broke, scattered back into the tree line without their leader left to hold them together. Wren, gold light finally guttering out from her hands, felt Kane's pulse steady beneath her palms, strong, sure, alive, a single heartbeat before her own vision washed white and the world tipped sideways beneath her. The last thing she felt before the dark took her under was his hand closing weakly around hers. And his voice, hoarse and terrified and impossibly grateful, breathing her name like a prayer. Chapter 9. What the Wolf Remembered. The first thing Wren became aware of was warmth. Sunlight, real and honest, falling soft across a bed she didn't recognize. In a room grander than any she'd ever slept in, high ceilings, pale stone walls, tall windows thrown open to let in air that smelled of pine and wood smoke instead of river mud. The second thing was Kane's hand, wrapped tight around hers, the low, rough catch of his breathing the moment she stirred. Wren, her name, breathed like a man who hadn't dared say it aloud in days for fear of jinxing the fragile hope it carried. "Wren, please, open your eyes." She did, slowly, blinking against light that felt too bright after days spent somewhere dark. He looked wrecked, beautiful and wrecked, dark circles carved deep beneath gold eyes gone glassy with relief. Several days' worth of stubble roughening a jaw she remembered tracing with her fingertips on a battlefield that already felt like a lifetime ago. "Hi," she managed, voice like gravel dragged across stone. Kane made a sound that was half laugh, half something closer to a sob, pressed his forehead to hers as though the contact alone could convince him she was truly real. "Hi," he echoed, "you absolute reckless menace. Do you have any idea what you put me through?" "I saved your life." "You very nearly ended your own doing it." His thumb traced slow, unsteady circles against her knuckles. 3 days, Wren, 3 days I sat in that chair not knowing whether you'd wake at all. And the entire time all I could think was that I had finally found you, only to lose you in the very same breath. "Well," Wren said, "I didn't, so perhaps save the lecture for a version of this where I actually died, and let this version simply be the part where you kiss me instead." He did, slow, careful, so thoroughly relieved she felt it settle into her bones, into the marrow, into whatever quiet place inside her had spent a lifetime bracing for the ground to give way. She was strong enough to sit up properly by that same afternoon, wrapped in blankets that smelled of cedar and mountain air, propped against pillows in a room she'd since learned belonged to the Duskryder stronghold's healing wing, when the door opened and half the household seemed to try to fit through it at once. Sable came first, eyes red-rimmed and swollen from days of crying she'd clearly tried and failed to hide. She didn't bother with words at all, simply crossed the room and folded Wren into a hug fierce enough to bruise. Shaking with the particular bone-deep relief of a woman who had spent a decade dreading exactly this moment, and had somehow, against all odds, survived it whole. "I am so sorry," Sable said into her hair, voice cracking, "for all of it, every single year I didn't tell you the truth." "You kept me alive," Wren said, hugging her back just as fiercely. "You raised me, You loved me even when it would have been so much easier to simply walk away and let me become someone else's problem entirely. She pulled back just far enough to look her friend properly in the eye. I'm still angry, Sable. I want you to know that. I'm angry it took 11 years and an army at the gate for the truth to come out, but I understand why you did it and I forgive you. Those two things can sit in the same chest at the same time. I've learned that much at least this week. Sable let out a wet, broken laugh, wiped at her eyes with the heel of her hand. That's more grace than I deserve. Probably, Wren agreed. Take it anyway. They sat with that a moment longer, Sable's hand still gripping hers, neither of them in any particular hurry to let go. Behind Sable, Commander Ashgrave hovered near the doorway with the stiff, uncertain posture of a man who still wasn't entirely sure he was welcome in the room at all. His eyes found Kane's. For a long moment neither of them spoke. I don't expect forgiveness, Ashgrave said, finally, voice low. I only wanted you to know I meant every word I said that night, and that I'm glad, more glad than I know how to say, that it ended the way it did. Kane crossed the room and gripped his oldest friend's forearm, hard, the way soldiers greet each other after a war neither expected to survive. 4 minutes didn't take my sister from me, Ashgrave, Kane said. 11 years of silence nearly took my friend, don't give me 11 more. Ashgrave's throat worked, he nodded once, said nothing further because nothing further needed saying. And behind him, arms crossed, expression caught somewhere between hostile and hopeful, stood Alara. Hi, Wren said into the silence because someone had to. We've technically met, though I was mostly unconscious for the good part, and you just stabbed your former guardian, so not exactly prime conversation conditions. A startled huff of laughter escaped Alara before she could stop it. You're strange, she said. For someone I was raised to think of as a weapon, you're remarkably unthreatening. I get that a lot. It's the healer training, very hard to be intimidating when your whole personality is hold still while I check that wound. Wren tilted her head. You saved his life today. You could have let Vosk finish it and walked away with everything you were ever taught to want. Instead you put a blade through the only father you remember. That's not nothing, Alara. Alara's jaw tightened, old grief and new, fragile freedom warring across her face. I don't know how to be whoever I'm supposed to be now. Welcome to the club, Wren said. We meet weekly. Attendance is mandatory, snacks are mediocre. That earned a real laugh, small, surprised. And across the room, Kane's eyes found Wren's, gratitude in them so plain it made her chest ache, because for the first time in 11 years the sister he'd mourned and the mate he'd claimed were sitting in the same room, and neither of them was a ghost. 2 weeks later the stronghold had settled into something close to peace, walls mended, wounded healed, wary eyes softening slowly into welcome. Alara stayed, careful and quiet but staying. Sable took up healing properly again, no longer hiding at the edge of nowhere. Ashgrave found his own steadier ground beside the alpha he'd once been too afraid to face. And through all of it the bond in Wren's chest kept humming, steady, warm, healed, a second heartbeat she was only just beginning to trust would stay. Chapter 10, What the Rain Gave Back. It was on an evening 2 weeks later, the sky over the stronghold gone soft gold with late summer light, that Kane found her sitting alone on the wide stone balcony outside her window, watching the pack gather for the evening meal in the courtyard below. You're hiding, he said, settling beside her, close enough that his warmth pressed along her side. I'm thinking there's a difference. Enlighten me. Wren was quiet a moment, turning her wrist over in the fading light, tracing the silver-bright scar there, no longer angry, no longer burning, healed clean and pale like something worn proudly instead of hidden. For 23 years I was Wren Ashdown, she said, a name a healer gave a baby she found half drowned in a river, and for about 4 very confusing hours I was almost Kane Duskryder. A name that never belonged to me at all. She glanced sideways at him. I don't think I want either of them, not really, not as the last word on who I am. Kane's hand found hers, steady, patient, utterly unhurried in the way he'd learned to be with her over these last 2 weeks, no longer the desperate, possessive urgency of a man half convinced he'd lose her the moment he looked away, but something calmer now. Something certain. Then who do you want to be? That's the question, isn't it? She smiled, small and real. Not who I was, not who someone else tried to make me, just who I choose to become now that I actually get to choose. And... Wren looked out over the courtyard, at Sable laughing with a pack healer twice her age, at Ashgrave and Alara sparring in the yard with more warmth between them than either would admit to, at the whole loud, golden, imperfect world Kane had built out of grief and stubbornness, and 11 years of refusing to give up on the people he loved. Felt something settle deep in her chest, quiet and sure. "Wren," she said finally, "I choose Wren, not because Sable gave it to me and not because I don't have another option, because it's mine, because I picked it this time with my eyes open, knowing everything it cost to get here." She turned to look at him fully. "Wren Duskryder, if you're still offering." Something in Kane's face cracked open entirely, all that careful, patient calm giving way at once to something raw and overwhelmed and achingly happy. Gold eyes bright with the particular light of a man who'd spent 11 years certain he'd never get to feel this again. "I have been offering," he said, voice rough, "since the moment I opened my eyes on your floor and told you that you were mine before I even knew your name." "You were feverish." "I was right." She laughed and he kissed her, slow and certain, the last golden light of evening pooling warm around them both while below the courtyard filled with the sound of a pack finally, fully at peace. Epilogue. Home. A year passed the way years do, quickly in memory, slowly in the living of it. Lady Seraphine had never existed in this story, but the shape of what remained still had to be tended. Corwin's stronghold equivalent, the quiet business of rebuilding, went on in ways nobody wrote songs about. Walls repaired, borders resettled, a truce brokered with what remained of the Shadowwolf territories once Elara stepped forward, unasked, to help broker it. Elara stayed close to the stronghold, though she never quite stopped being careful about it, quick to retreat to the training yard when a room got too warm with feeling, slow to let anyone call her sister out loud even after she'd clearly started thinking it. Wren didn't push, some healing happened on its own schedule and pushing only slowed it down. Sable took up a proper post in the stronghold's healing wing, and within a season the younger healers were quietly fighting over who got to apprentice under her. Ashgrave visited Kane's study most evenings now, not out of guilt anymore, Wren thought, but because two men who'd once nearly lost each other to 11 years of silence had discovered they simply liked each other's company, once the silence was gone. It was an ordinary evening, much like the one where all of this had truly begun, though the storm outside now was gentler, more autumn than the wild fury of that first flooded night, more memory than threat. Wren sat before the small parlor fire with a basket of mending she no longer strictly needed to do, and did anyway because her hands had never learned to sit idle and saw no reason to start now. Kane came in near 10 as he always did and settled into the chair across from hers. For a while neither of them spoke because they'd learned over the past year that the silence between them was its own kind of conversation. The good kind, the kind that never needed filling. He reached across eventually and took her hand from her mending, drew the glove from it, finger by finger, slow and deliberate, the same way he'd done the very first evening he'd asked her to marry him, and laced his bare fingers through hers. "A wolf howled out past the river just now," he said, "just the once made me think of that night." "Which night?" "You know which night." She did, she always would. She looked at the hand he was holding, still faintly rough from work, still exactly the kind of hands a Shadowwolf had once called nothing more than a weapon, and had turned out in the end to be the truest ones in the whole stronghold. "It was raining," she said simply. "Someone had to go get you." He smiled at that, the small, unpracticed smile she'd learned, over a year of marriage, to treasure more than another man's whole laugh, worth more for how rarely it was given and how entirely it was meant, and drew her hand up to press his mouth once, unhurried, against her knuckles. Said nothing further because nothing further needed saying. Outside, the wolf called once more and was still. The fire settled low, the glove lay forgotten on the arm of her chair, and neither of them moved to pick it up. She understood it fully now, sitting there with her husband's hand around hers and a whole hard-won life stretched out quiet and gold before them, that it had never really been about who was watching, from a riverbank or a battlefield or a throne. It had only ever been about the kneeling itself, about choosing, in the mud with nothing to gain and everything still to lose, to drag a dying stranger home anyway. The end. Thanks for listening.